Hey, Martine here. So a quick note before we play today's episode. I am still in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention, and let me tell you, there is a lot going on here. Former President Donald Trump is set to speak Thursday night. There will be a lot to unpack from that speech. And at the same time, there's also a ton of news happening on the Democratic side of things around President Biden and the future of his candidacy. So I wanted to let you know to look for an in-depth breakdown of all of that news by looking up the campaign moment wherever you're listening. And then tomorrow, on Friday, we'll have our usual end-of-the-week political roundtable. All right, here's today's episode of Post Reports. Thanks so much.
Joan Benoit's life changed when she was 27 years old.
Well, I think it was warm. You know, when the race started, it was, what do they call it, that marine fog? It was gray and damp.
This was 40 years ago. She was about to run in the very first women's Olympic marathon.
Well, I was sort of in disbelief. I mean, I hoped that it might happen someday.
She was racing in the 1984 Summer Games in Los Angeles. Those games would be a test for the Olympics. For Joan, it was also a test.
I wasn't the favorite. I was not the favorite in the race.
Just weeks before the Olympics were to begin, Joan had knee surgery, and a lot of people were counting her out.
I remember Life magazine wanting to do a feature story on me, and then they heard about my knee and the fact that I probably wasn't going to run, and they did a big Olympic story, and they had a little inset of me in a Lons nightgown and a rocking chair, sipping on a mug of tea.
I was able to track down this photo, and there she is, young Joan sitting next to a window in a long striped flannel nightgown with ruffles. Lance is the brand name, as I later learned. The magazine was assuming she wouldn't even participate in the race. The caption laments, quote, "It would have been an epic contest."
You know, that added fuel to fire too. You know, I'm always up for a challenge.
The 50 call for their marks.
The day of the race was August 5th. Joan and 49 other women were at the starting line, inside a stadium at Santa Monica City College.
And there you go. The first ever Olympic women's marathon.
From Santa Monica, the course went south along the Pacific coast. For part of it, the athletes actually ran on the Marina Freeway.
Again, there's Joan Benoit, and she has reached the freeway.
It ended at the Coliseum Stadium in downtown LA.
Look at that crowd. I mean, it's just incredible.
There were quite a few people along the road, and then the sun broke about halfway through the race after I came off the freeway.
Joan Benoit had taken an early lead in the race, and she kept it.
Joan Benoit, as you can see there, the huge lead that Benoit has built up.
As Joan entered the tunnel leading into the stadium, she could hear the roar of the crowd on the other side.
I heard the people getting to their feet and cheering.
Here she comes.
But I didn't expect the Coliseum to be full when I came out of the tunnel.
And listen to the crowd as she emerges.
I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that all these people had come out to watch these women run.
Joan was interviewed by ABC, which had the broadcast rights that year, moments after winning gold.
If it hadn't been for the work of countless women pioneers in the sport, we wouldn't be here today. And let's hope that in 1988 we can also run a 5 and 10K, because we showed today that women can be very competitive over this distance.
You know, all my records have gone, but the fact that I won the first women's Olympic marathon will always be part of history.
Joan's gold medal and this moment were part of a much bigger win at the time. In a lot of ways, the 1984 Olympic Games were an experiment to see whether the Games could reinvent themselves for a modern era. It's a question that's being asked again right now.
1984 is sort of that moment where the Olympics were saved.
From the newsroom of the Washington Post, this is Post Reports. It is Thursday, July 18th. I'm Ted Muldoon, the guest host for today. I'm a senior producer with the show, and I will be part of the post team in Paris for the Summer Olympics. The opening ceremony is just over a week away. The big day is July 26th. And as we count down the days to this year's games, we are going back to 1984 to ask whether 2024 can be another turning point for the Olympics. Les Carpenter, you are a sports reporter for the Post, and your full-time job is just to cover the Olympics. Is that right?
That's correct.
What do you do? Like, what is your job?
I spend a lot of time studying the Olympics, understanding where the Olympics relate in society. I follow a lot of the top athletes. It's such a mix of who we are as a society, who we are politically, who we are in the world. I think all that comes together with the Olympics.
We are taking a journey back to the 1984 Olympics and what it took for them to be a success. You're going to be our guide through the business decisions, the innovations at the time, the Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union, and we're going to hear some other voices from that time along the way. I was not born yet in 1984, so learning Joan Benoit's story at the top was really fascinating to me. Why did you feel like it was so important to revisit 1984 ahead of this year's Summer Games in Paris?
I think the reason I'm really looking at that Olympics is that came at a moment when the Olympics looked like they were about dead. And then out of nowhere came the spectacular Olympics, and it kind of changed the way that Olympics were sort of run. It was this idea of the big, flashy, exotic Olympics that were kind of a big deal that put the city on the map. All these things came after the 84 games. The 1984 Olympics showed everyone that you can have an Olympics that's affordable, that can make money. And they did it by reinventing the way you do the Olympics. They showed that you could have spectacular settings. They made the opening ceremony a really big show. Of course, it had Hollywood written all over it. They had a torch run that went across the country and got spirit built for the games. There's a lot of things about that games that just sort of changed the way we think about the Olympics. I think that matters now as we're going into Paris, because the Olympics sort of need to be reinvented again. People have lost faith in the Olympics a little bit. I think younger viewers have drifted away some. The enthusiasm isn't quite there. Scandals and costs have sort of worn people down. Pandemic Olympics were sort of empty. And along comes Paris with these new ideas. Just like LA, they're going to do something different. There's going to be an opening ceremony out in the river. They're going to put the games all throughout the city. It's a whole new way of looking at the Olympics. And it comes at a time when the Olympics really need something different and exciting to carry it going forward.
Before we dig into 1984, I was hoping you could just kind of explain how the modern Olympics began and what they were meant to be in the first place.
The Olympics were reinvented in the late 1800s by a French aristocrat who had this idea that exercise was something that could really help the youth of the time, as well as if you had a sporting event and you could bring people from all over the world, that would let cultures understand each other and that you could probably cut down on wars.
So this is the whole world peace thing I hear associated with the Olympics oftentimes. Is that like what that's getting after?
Yeah, it's totally getting after the world peace and the exchange of cultures and the idea that through sport, everyone can kind of get along with each other.
And so from there, how did the Olympics evolve?
The Olympics evolved fairly quickly. The first Olympics were in 1896 in Greece. The next few weren't spectacular, but as you got into 1912, games started to matter a little bit more. Then came World War I. After World War I, I think the Olympics really took off. I think the idea of the countries of the world getting together through sport really mattered. The games 100 years ago in Paris, the last ones that were in that city, were a pretty big deal. There was a lot of really iconic stuff that happened there. And it sailed on in until you had World War II, and it fell off again. But then after World War II, the Olympics just soared. There were some iconic games, Rome in 1960, Mexico City in 1968, and then they started to tail off. In 1972, there was the attack at the Munich Olympics by terrorists against the Israeli athletes and coaches.
There were 11 hostages tonight. They're all gone.
In 1976, Montreal went bankrupt almost trying to run the Olympics.
The Olympic Games will start here in a partly finished stadium and complex that has already cost almost $1 billion too much.
Denver gave back the 1976 Olympics because it couldn't even fund them.
We're in the lucky position we don't have to spend taxpayers' money to promote the state of Colorado or its tourist industry. Lord knows we can hardly handle the growth we have.
1980, the United States led a boycott of the Moscow Olympics. This had to do with the fact that the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan.
The decision has been made. The American people are convinced that we should not go to the Summer Olympics.
Without a doubt, the viewership for the 1980 Olympics cratered once the United States wasn't in. I myself didn't remember watching it at all. I don't think many people did. I think at that point, the Olympics as a quote-unquote movement was lost. The International Olympic Committee, or IOC, which runs the Olympics, was near bankruptcy. I don't know that the IOC had a real plan for how to go forward in sort of how do you market Olympics, how do you sell an Olympics, how do, in a modern world, you fund these things. So right after Montreal, it's in 1978, the IOC is getting ready to award the 1984 Olympics, and there's only two candidates. It's Los Angeles and Tehran. And not long after that, Tehran has to drop out because of the beginnings of the Islamic Revolution there. And so essentially, the 84 Olympics were given to Los Angeles by default. It was almost kind of like a little thing that Los Angeles would bid every year for the Olympics and would always get turned down. They had held it in 1932, and it didn't seem like anyone was going to give it to them again. And then out of nowhere, here is 1984, and nobody else wants the Olympics except for LA.
And how did the citizens of Los Angeles feel about this? I mean, just being the only people there, were they afraid at all what that could mean for their city?
So at the time that this happened, I mean, I was growing up in Los Angeles in the late 70s. I remember very distinctly the consternation of people over what had happened in Montreal. We can't allow this to happen in our city. We can't allow our city to go bankrupt for an Olympics. LA has always had bad traffic. There was a huge worry, like, how are you possibly going to have this big sprawling Olympics all over the city with all the traffic that LA has? And so there was a very, very, very strong skepticism in LA about whether or not people wanted to do this.
So, to get LA's buy-in, there had to be a whole new financial model for how to fund the Olympics. Up until this point, past Olympic Games were heavily funded by the host city and country.
The entire concept was radically different than anything that had been tried before.
Rich Perlman ran media operations for the 1984 LA Games.
Because everything was based on private financing. There was no government money. There was a city charter amendment that was overwhelmingly passed by the citizens of Los Angeles, something like 68%, that said that no money could be spent on the games unless it was reimbursed by the organizing committee. There were no representatives of the government at any level that were members of the board of directors. So everything had to be done privately, which is no different than running the Dodgers or the Lakers or the Rams, or any of the other privately owned sports teams that were in the area.
So once LA got the Olympics, then there comes the committee that's going to actually run the games, and that's called the Los Angeles Olympic Organizing Committee.
And who is the brave soul to actually run this committee?
So kind of out of nowhere, and this was a bit of a surprise to people, a travel executive named Peter Yubero wound up being elected the head of the LA Olympic Organizing Committee. No one really saw this coming because those things had always been given to people who were sort of sports officials. And here comes this travel executive.
Peter Yubero is in his 80s now. We weren't able to speak with him for this story, but I found a speech he gave back in 2007. This was at the University of Oregon Lundquist College of Business. And I should say before I play it that we have not been able to verify the story he tells. It's not clear if maybe he's just trying to get a laugh, but it gives a good flavor of Yubero's personality.
When I was selected to run the Olympic Games in 1980, the newspaper immediately said, we don't even know who this guy is. The head of the NFL, Pete Rozelle, had applied. Many other people had applied for this position, and an unknown travel agent was picked. And so they were mad, and they said, let's go find out where he went to school. And so they sent the reporters out, and they went to, USC and UCLA. No Yubero. Then they went to Stanford, and then to Harvard and Yale. Came up here to Oregon. It took them about a week to find San Jose State.
Go Spartans.
Yeah, right. And on the front page of the paper, the LA Times, that first day, it said that Yubero had graduated in the 50s on an athletic scholarship. He graduated in the 50s, and he graduated in the top 83% of his class.
I talked to the LA Times. They were not able to find what he's describing. But even if there was skepticism at first, it's worth noting that the paper's coverage looking back at these games has featured headlines like how Peter Yubero saved the Olympics and revolutionized the games, and Peter Yubero's LA Olympics, bigger, better, richer. Rich Perlman remembers the initial reaction to Yubero's appointment.
Well, I wouldn't say it was an out-of-the-box choice because there wasn't a box. The question of who do you hire really came down to, do you want to find someone who knows how to manage large enterprises, large companies, because this was going to be a large company when the games actually took place? Or do you want to find someone who knows how to grow a business and make a big business out of nothing?
After Yubero was chosen, at first he was excited, and then they handed him a box with $300,000 in bills from the whole getting the Olympics together.
Oh, from the bidding process?
From the bidding process.
Was there an actual physical box?
He was handed a physical cardboard box, and inside were all the bills that the LA Olympic Committee was going to have to pay before they even got started.
Incredible.
And there's no bank account, and he takes $100 of his own money to go open a bank account. What was Peter like?
Well, I found him to be terrific. If you were going to work for Peter Yubero and if you were going to be successful, you needed to understand what your job was, and you needed to make sure that that job was getting done, and was getting done in an efficient and forthright and hopefully thrifty way.
Yubero was interviewed in a 1983 Time magazine cover story. He said, quote, "The games must be more intimate, and above all, the games must be less expensive." So he inherits what you said, $300,000 in debt? How much money does it take to run an Olympics?
He kind of looked down and figured you needed about $500 million to actually run the Los Angeles Olympics.
$500 million.
$500 million. But that's not necessarily easy money to find without going to the city of Los Angeles or the state of California to get it. It was a pretty big task.
And one thing that he had working in his favor was that there was already some infrastructure from the previous Olympics, right? Can you kind of explain that component?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's paralyzed a lot of Olympics before 1984 and even some after is the fact that cities have felt compelled to go out, we got to build a big stadium. We've got to build this. We've got to build the swimming facility. We've got to build, these other stadiums for these other sports. LA, because it still had the Coliseum right in the middle of downtown.
That's like the iconic building, right?
Yeah, so the Coliseum downtown in LA, I think is still one of my favorite buildings. It was built originally as a memorial for World War I veterans, but quickly as the Olympics came along in 1932, it became the stadium for the 1932 Olympics. It's this massive, massive structure. At one end, this would be the eastern end of it, is this sort of magnificent sort of marble structure that they call the peristyle. And on the top in the middle was where they put the flame.
We couldn't do a zero build, but we were pretty close. We built 3 facilities for sports.
They really didn't have to build much at all, which made it financially doable.
That's Kathleen Decker. She's an editor at the Post now, but back in 1984, she was a reporter at the LA Times covering the Olympics.
This was basically use what you got. I mean, they were under, I think, an extreme level of stress, I would say. If they had come up, $400 million short, their lives as business people would have been over.
When you think of the big ideas that Yubero came to the table with about how to reinvent, how to fund the Olympics, how would you distill those ideas?
Yeah, so what Yubero brought was this idea of funding the Olympics, not through the state, but through selling sponsorships to corporations and by going and getting large television rights deals.
What was he proposing? And like, how are they so different than how they used to work?
So before 1984, I don't think a lot of these organizing committees for Olympics put a lot of attention into the television deals. The U.S. was by far the biggest, but even then, they weren't paying a great deal of money, whatever network ultimately won the rights. And so what Yubero kind of came up with was cable television is booming, and there's a lot more money in it. And he kind of bet big on the idea that he could get all the American television networks to bid against each other so much that somebody will pay over $300 million for him. And that would be an absolutely astronomical sum, especially when you look back at Montreal, and I think the U.S. television rights were $25 million.
Yeah, it's 10 to 1 difference.
It's enormous. And so he gets the networks, and they each had to put down a deposit of $750,000. That was just to even begin to bid. Then he took all that money, he invested it in a small kind of CD at the time, which in those days, the interest rates were astronomical. And now he's got all this money that he could go and pay all the bills and start operating the Olympics. So in the fall of 79, they finally hold the bidding. ABC winds up winning it. It agrees to pay $225 million. And then on top of that, ABC will pay $100 million to actually handle all the production. That means all the filming, the actual sending of the signal, all to the rest of the world.
So tell me, it's $325 million?
$325 million.
So
now.
He did it. He did.
He absolutely did it. I mean, he went from Montreal, where U.S. rights were $25 million, to $325 million in 1984. I mean, it's amazing. And I don't think the IOC ever saw it coming.
So that's the television deal, which already has made a significant chunk of money. But you also said that corporate sponsorships were a big part of his plan, Yubero's plan. So tell me more about those. Like, how do those operate?
Yeah, well, he still needs $500 million to run his Olympics, and $325 million helps, but he needs more than that. And so I think he went to look at the corporate world. In the past, sponsorship deals were very ragged things at the Olympics. You would have maybe 10 different toothpastes.
So it'd be like Colgate and Crest.
Exactly. And they were just more like handouts. They weren't necessarily big money deals. They were tiny, tiny money deals. The Olympics each year barely made any money, if any, off of their sponsorships.
There was no defined concept of exactly what it is that you get from the Olympic Games beyond the ability to use the rings in very constrained circumstances.
So I think he has this idea that if he has an exclusive toothpaste, if he has an exclusive camera, if he has an exclusive soft drink, those people will pay more money because they are exclusive.
The LAOC pioneered this concept of category exclusivity. The idea was that you couldn't have Kodak and Fuji. You could have Kodak or Fuji.
So he went to each one of these sort of products that were big deals at the time and said, okay, we need an official soft drink. We need an official fast food. We need an official photocopier. We need an official camera company. And then he went to all those different companies and said, okay, you want to be the official company of the 84 Olympics? It's going to be a minimum bid of $4 million, which was huge money for these companies in those days. They didn't spend that kind of money on the Olympics.
And the first round of companies that wanted to come on, we signed by the end of 1979. And the first one was Coca-Cola.
There were some others that jumped on pretty quick. The one that's kind of famous is Kodak. Kodak had always been involved in the Olympics. When Yubero comes to them with, well, you're going to have to bid at least $4 million, Kodak balks.
They assumed that they were going to be the sponsor for 1984, and they seemed to feel that they had the LAOC over a barrel. Yubero was never someone who was over a barrel, ever.
So he turns around and goes to Fuji, Japanese film company, and says, here's this $4 million basic offer. You have 3 days. And they came back and said, okay, let's do a deal. And they cut a deal ultimately for $7 million.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
The deal got done, and the Kodak people were livid. Fuji's story is one of the great exemplars of how the LAOC approached the sponsorship, and really the sponsorship program which has powered sports marketing for 40 years.
When the Olympic Games open next summer, a dazzling new performer will be there. Fujicolor HR, official film of the Los Angeles 1984 Olympics.
As the Olympics approach in 84, and I really remember this, I was in high school at the time, you start seeing ads, and it's like McDonald's. It's the official fast food company of the Olympics.
Feel like you're part of the Olympic action. Play McDonald's. When the U.S. wins, you win Olympic Games.
Or we're the official copier of the Olympics.
Introducing the Xerox 1048 Marathon Copier, official sponsor of the 1984 Olympics.
You would hear this over and over and over again.
As official airline of the 84
The
Olympics.
official 35-millimeter.
The official car of the
official snack food of the 1984 Olympics.
You were also seeing athletes in commercials and on television like never before.
Looking good, Edwin Moses, looking good.
You can look good too, wearing this official U.S. track and field team uniform.
Suddenly it was this parade of American athletes everywhere on American TV. And the effect of that was it boosted the athlete's celebrity.
Peter Yubero reached out to people like myself.
That's the voice of Edwin Moses, the star American hurdler.
He made sure that we as athletes knew that we were the main focus of the Olympic Games and we were to take part at every level.
Edwin Moses, let's meet him up close and personal.
ABC really played up the athletes like never before.
In 1983, Edwin Moses earned about $458,000. He'll make more this year. It wasn't always like that.
Really telling their stories, going into their backgrounds, sort of setting this drama before every event of who the athlete was and why you should care and why you should want to watch, to the point where once the event happened, you were fully invested in that person.
Peter Yubero was the guy who really made it all possible, who engaged athletes, who came up with the marketing model for reaching out to global corporations, national corporations, and made sure that we were going to be considered for endorsements, commercial opportunities, and so forth. And that was really the start of all of the significant changes in sports marketing.
After the break, how the Cold War almost destroyed the 1984 LA Olympics. We'll be right back. So, Les, we have talked about all the different ways that Peter Yubero helped reinvent the financial model for the Olympics back in 1984. But let's also not lose sight of that this was also in the middle of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. I'm wondering, how were those things impacting Yubero's plans for the LA Olympics that year?
So going into 1984, the obvious question was, well, will the Soviets come and will the countries from the Soviet bloc come?
Remember, both countries were locked in what felt like an existential battle for survival. The U.S. had boycotted the Olympics when they were in Moscow just 4 years earlier, in 1980. And now, Americans fear that the Soviets might return the favor.
What everybody had been hoping for Los Angeles was that after 1980 and the U.S. boycott, that there would be a full Olympics again, and that the illusion of international unity would be back in style.
There had been this optimism that the Soviets would show up to the LA Olympics. And while this question still loomed over the games, the torch run was about to kick off in New York City.
There had been torch runs in the past, but in this case, Yubero had this idea. Again, he's going on the whole marketing idea. Well, let's have the torch go all across the United States. We'll start at the UN, because it has to be the UN to bring the world together after 1980. And the torch is going to go way up, and then it went way down to the southern parts of the United States. It went 9,000 miles before it got to L.A., and the idea was it would generate all this interest in the Olympics.
The audio of the ceremony in New York is from a documentary that AT&T produced about the torch run that year.
Yubero was in New York at the United Nations. It was this day in May. It was going to finally happen. The torch was going to go around the country.
It is appropriate that the Olympic flame start its journey 15,000 kilometers across this nation right here in New York City.
And the torch goes and runs off, and within 2 hours comes the word the Soviet Union has pulled out.
Good evening. Until today, not many people believed the Soviet Union would stay away from the Summer Olympics here in Los Angeles. The Soviets are blaming it on the Reagan administration.
So the Soviet Union said, we aren't going to come because we don't think it's going to be safe. I don't think anyone ever truly believed it. I think most people thought, no, the Soviet Union didn't come because this was going to be retaliation for 1980.
It's believed that Moscow wants to pay the U.S. back for 1980, and that given the current lowly state of U.S.-Soviet relations, they can get even at little or no political cost.
And of course, once the Soviet Union doesn't come, then East Germany doesn't come, and Soviet bloc countries start one by one announcing they're not coming either.
Today, 2 more communist countries, Czechoslovakia and Laos, said that they would also join the boycott.
I remember there being a crestfallen feeling when it happened that it would not be a full Olympics.
And Yubero is working frantically to try and convince countries not to boycott.
We will use every ounce of energy to try and reverse this decision in behalf of the athletes of the world.
What we did, there was a calling program and a lobbying program from everybody who knows anybody in a foreign National Olympic Committee. And what we did in a matter of about 7 to 10 days is we were able to counter the Soviet boycott by saying that a record number of countries was going to come to the games, and that was a very effective counter.
Ultimately, he got Romania to agree to come, which was significant because Romania had some, especially in gymnastics, some very peak performances in previous Olympics. And so that did add a layer of legitimacy to the games. But still, yes, the Soviet Union is not there. The East Germans are not there. And so there is a real fear 2 months before the games start that, this is going to be a disaster. But the Soviet and East German boycott didn't kill the Olympics the way many people thought it would. Instead, people got inspired. The torch run really took off.
People across the country were lining up to see the torch as it passed through their hometowns. The route zigzagged through 33 states and the District of Columbia.
We got here and we saw it, and no one will ever take that away.
Everybody was excited with you. It was a great feeling. It was a great emotional high.
It was really thrilling. My heart just skipped a little.
You know, patriotism is alive and well in America, I'll tell you for sure. It gave me a shot in the arm.
As it wound its way around the country, people were very excited and ran out to go see it. There's one famous commercial that kind of captures this best. It was done by Budweiser. You know, it's early morning. The sun has just come up. There's these 2 farmers.
Suppose that's him? Don't know who else would be out this early.
They're out working in the middle of this field somewhere.
For the Caldwells, early morning's the best time to get things done.
They see something in the distance on the road, and then they get to the fence just as the flame is going by, and it's like 2 cars, the guy with the flame, and they just stand there, and of course they take off their hats and they applaud. It's so earnest. And, and this was sort of a feeling that people carried into that Olympics. I think the torch run was such a wild success. It fueled such patriotism, partially through the Bud Light ad, through other things as well, that I think, people are still getting excited.
I mean, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the fears, all of the worries about this not living up to its potential kind of ended on opening ceremonies night.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening ceremonies of the Games of the 23rd Olympiad at Los Angeles.
And remember, the Coliseum, this massive Gothic building with its peristyle, with the columns, is all sort of decked out in the colors of the LA Olympics. It looks fantastic. They painted it up. It's looked better than it ever has, and it's packed. And it's a really good show. They have a guy in a jetpack flying around.
Probably my most vivid memory of the whole Olympics was the opening ceremonies, and we as the host nation marched last.
That's Joan Benoit again, the marathon runner.
And the Romanians were the only Eastern Bloc country at the time to not boycott. And every athlete from every nation just wanted to embrace the Romanians, to thank them for coming and, support them. And that's truly what I remember.
And then the flame comes in, and it goes around a couple times.
the flame will be lit by one of America's greatest athletes, Olympic gold medalist Rayford Johnson.
Rayford Johnson was a famous Olympian. He won a decathlon in 1960, but he was known to everybody in the United States at the time and anyone who followed the Olympics at all. And he takes the flame and he takes it on its final run, and he goes up the staircase at that end of the stadium where the peristyle is, and he gets to the top, and it's still like a good, probably 150 feet, 200 feet to the flame. And out of nowhere rises this staircase. And it's kind of rickety looking. It's not a glorious looking staircase at all. It's just kind of this flimsy thing that comes up out of the ground, and there's no railings on either side. And he starts running up it. And Rayford's not a young man at the time either. And he starts running up it. He sort of puts his hand down a couple times on the stairs just to balance himself, but he gets there and then he kind of has to hold it leaning back, and it kind of shoots up this tube and then the flame lights. And it's kind of this magical moment.
The vividness of it to me was just the joy. Like, I wasn't with the rich people in the Yubero suite. I was literally on opening and closing ceremonies outside the Coliseum, behind the nylon barriers they had put up so that people who couldn't afford the tickets couldn't even see in the Coliseum. And even out there, people are on like little Sony Watchmans watching the opening ceremonies that are happening over the fence. And you would have thought that might engender some resentment and just sort of like, we're outside the walls again kind of sentiment. But instead, there were all these people gathered in the park outside the Coliseum, cheering, singing along with whatever people could hear coming out from the inside, and just emotional.
So the games start, and there's so many iconic performances. Carl Lewis wins gold in the 100-meter, the 200-meter, the 4x100-meter relay, and the long jump as well. Evelina Ashford won the 100-meter. Mary Lou Retton won gold in gymnastics. Greg Louganis won gold in diving. But probably my favorite was Edwin Moses, the hurdler, who had already won gold in Montreal and was well established as one of America's top hurdlers, and now was finally running in his home country.
They stay in their lanes all the way around. Crowd is silent. This time it is a clean start. 13 steps between hurdles. That is well known.
The crowd was just, I had never heard noise like that when that gun went off. It was just so loud. Everyone in the stadium stood up, and about the third or the fourth hurdle, amongst all that screaming, and on a rubber track, I could actually hear the steps of the guys like 2-3 lanes behind me, even amongst all that noise. It was like a inner body experience type of surreal moments that my hearing was so acute that above all that noise, I could hear footsteps on the track.
Heading for the finish line, Edwin Moses winning the gold medal with Danny Harris finishing second.
Well, that was the happiest finish of a race that I ever had. I mean, I was visibly smiling at the end of that race because there was so much tension.
And the U.S. starts winning and winning and winning and winning.
Because of the boycott, the United States went crazy. The U.S. won 174 medals. So you talk about red, white, and blue, the whole place was red, white, and blue.
So it just becomes a sea of these podiums with the Americans standing at the top and the American flag going up and the Star-Spangled Banner playing. And so it creates sort of this all-American Olympics. It wasn't the intent. I think Peter Yubero and the other organizers really feared that the Olympics would be diminished by the Soviets not being there. Instead, it became a bigger deal in the United States, and everybody was really happy.
We talked at the beginning of this episode about how the Paris Olympics are kind of at another inflection point, that they need to reinvent themselves in some way, as they did in '84, as Peter Yubero helped reinvent the LA Games. Do you think there are any lessons to be learned about how the LA Olympics reinvented themselves in '84?
So the irony, I think, of 1984 is that Peter Yubero invented this system. of commercializing the Olympics to make money. So therefore, you could pay for your games, and you can therefore open the door for all these other cities to bid for games. But what also happened is nobody paid attention to what made the 84 Olympics work, which was the fact that there were existing facilities that kept the cost down. As the years went on, people spent more and more and more, and they built more and more and more and more and more. And the Olympics got more and more and more and more expensive, to the point now where 40 years later, the lesson of 84 seems almost forgotten. And the IOC is trying frantically to get the future cities to say, no, we got to do it like LA did it. Paris is the first one to come along. They've only built 2 real new facilities. They built a diving center and a small arena, both of which will be used heavily after the Olympics. You're going to start seeing that in more and more Olympics going forward. I think that's one big lesson that Paris has taken from that. I think another lesson that Paris certainly has seized upon, and I think others could, is the creativity. Peter Yubero was creative. The people he brought in were creative. They had to be. They had no choice. They weren't going to be funded by the city of LA or the state of California or the United States government. They were going to have to figure out a way to pay for this Olympics. And therefore, they had a successful Olympics because of it. You look now, people are trying to figure out, how do you make the Olympics special again? I think Paris has sort of seized upon that. The leaders in Paris have said, let's do an opening ceremony on the Seine. Let's have the spectacular opening ceremony at the end in front of the Eiffel Tower, where there'll be fireworks, and the athletes are going to be on boats in the Seine, and you're going to have all these events in the middle of the city with spectacular settings. No Olympics has ever looked like this before. No opening ceremony has ever been held outside of a stadium. This will be the first time you're going to have it out somewhere in the public.
Really?
The first time in an Olympics.
Wow.
Never happened before. This is kind of a first big test of kind of the new way of looking at the Olympics. Is that going to work? Using existing facilities, using kind of a spectacular city, trying to find ways to keep the costs down.
But in this moment, it doesn't feel like the costs are the only things the Olympics are contending with. The games are happening against this backdrop of 2 high-profile wars in both Gaza and Ukraine, the inevitable security concerns that come with that. Russia as a country is not participating in these games. I guess I'm wondering, what else needs to happen in order for the Paris experiments to be a success?
The Olympics has to be spectacular. It needs to have this great backdrop. It needs to have Paris really glow every night from the television. That almost kind of brings that magic back, that makes it feel special, that here is this big event in this big city that many people maybe haven't even seen yet, but just are absolutely awed by. I think that the Olympics has a chance in Paris to jump out at everyone, to say, yeah, this is a big deal again.
To capture people's imaginations again.
It needs to capture people's imaginations again. I don't know that you could ever replicate 1984, but there's nothing to say that another Olympics can't come along and be just as big a surprise. I think Paris could be that one. I can see Paris being that Olympics that everyone remembers and says, wow, the Olympics were cool again.
Joan Benoit, who again made history back in 1984, also says she's hopeful. And she still feels connected to the Olympics.
I felt I was part of something. I mean, I'm very excited about Paris, but I hope they're great games, but I think 2028 in LA is going to be unbelievable, because it's the Olympics that a lot of people remember more vividly than other Olympics.
That's the other thing. If Paris falls short this year, LA is getting another shot at reviving the Summer Games in 4 years. Les Carpenter covers the Olympics for The Post. Audio of the torch race, courtesy of AT&T Archives and History Center. Audio of the 1984 Olympic events, courtesy of ABC Sports Collection, managed by ESPN. Audio of Yubero, courtesy of runnerspace.com. Special thanks to Rocky Mountain PBS. So again, the Olympics begin a week from tomorrow. As we publish this, I am starting to pack my bags to head to Paris. I'll be joining a big team from The Post to cover all the biggest moments from the Games. We're launching a brand new podcast next week just to keep up with everything that's happening at the Olympics this year. It's called The Sports Moment. It's hosted by sports reporter Ava Wallace, and she'll be your guide to the Paris Games. Our first episode publishes on Wednesday, July 24th, but the trailer is out now, so make sure you follow wherever you get your podcasts. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was produced and mixed by me, Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Renita Jablonski. Thanks to Matt Rennie. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.